Welcome, everyone. Tonight, we're privileged at our liberal arts university of venerable tradition, Bucknell University, to hear and participate in a discussion on the legacy of Winston S. Churchill, the famous Prime Minister of the United Kingdom during its wartime struggle against Nazism. Prime Minister Churchill has become a focus of competing narratives, especially in recent years, with further examination of his crucial wartime leadership, as well as his continued promotion of the British Empire and colonialism and implications for the burgeoning study of issues of race in academia today. This year, 2022, marks the 80th anniversary of what arguably was a high watermark of Churchill's leadership of the Allied effort against Hitler in 1942. Which later in the year saw Allied victory led by the British at the Battle of El Alamein in North Africa over German forces. For the first time in a couple years, due to the Battle of Britain and concerns with German bombing attacks and threat of invasion, church bells rang out across the United Kingdom for the victory in celebration of it. Churchill himself said in one of his famous wartime speeches that year that this is not the end, it is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning. On a micro level, we may not be able to say that tonight's program is the end of the beginning of re-examining Churchill as a figure of both history and legend in the following century. But I know we can say that we are blessed to have three top scholars on this issue with us tonight. I'll introduce all three now, and then we'll proceed to have each give a presentation. We'll have time after that for discussion among the panelists and with our guests, both present and online, after they present. Thanks to everyone who came out on this wintry night at the Bucknell campus and to all our virtual guests joining us from around the country and internationally. Tonight's discussion is sponsored by the Bucknell Program for American Leadership, a faculty association dedicated in accord with Bucknell's mission statement to different cultures and diverse perspectives in the liberal arts tradition. Thanks to our alumni supporters in the Open Discourse Coalition for providing the resources for making tonight's discussion possible for the Bucknell community. I'll introduce the speakers now in order of their presentations. Larry P. Arnn is the 12th president of Hillsdale College, where he is also a professor of politics and history. He received his BA from Arkansas State University and his MA and PhD in government from the Claremont Graduate School. He also studied at Worcester College, Oxford University, where he served as director of research for Sir Martin Gilbert, the official biographer of Winston Churchill. From 1985 to 2000, he served as president of the Claremont Institute for the Study of Statesmanship and Political Philosophy. In 1996, he was the founding chairman of the California Civil Rights Initiative, which prohibited racial preferences in state hiring, contracting, and admissions. Dr. Arnn's writings include the book Churchill's Trial, Winston Churchill and the Salvation of Free Government. Professor Sean McMeekin received the AB from Stanford University, MA and PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, and also studied at University of Paris 7, Moscow State University, and elsewhere internationally. Professor of History at Bard since 2014, he previously taught at universities in Istanbul and Ankara and at Yale University. His books include The Russian Revolution and Stalin's War, as well as History's Greatest Heist, The Looting of Russia by the Bolsheviks, and The Red Millionaire, a political biography of Will Munzenberg, Moscow's secret propaganda czar in the West. And he has had his work reviewed on the cover of the New York Times Book Review, among other places. He's won numerous fellowships and prizes for his work. And last but not least, Dr. Madhusri Mukherjee. Dr. Mukherjee graduated from Jadavpur University and obtained the PhD in physics from the University of Chicago with postdoctoral studies at the California Institute of Technology. She is a senior editor with Scientific American and writes about global issues of science, the environment, climate change, colonialism, development, indigenous rights, and animal research. Her book, Churchill's Secret War, The British Empire and the Ravaging of India During World War II, focused on how Winston Churchill and his physicist advisor, Frederick Lindemann, drew on Indian resources to fight the Second World War at the time of the devastating Bengal famine. We'll start with an opening talk by Dr. Arnn, who joins us from snowbound South Central Michigan. Dr. Arnn, thanks so much for joining us tonight. Please welcome Dr. Arnn.
Thank you, Father. Nice to see everybody. I was really hoping to come to Bucknell University, but I am in snowed-in Hillsdale, Michigan, and I'm sorry not to be with you all. Okay, so we're all asked the question by the title that the mischievous priest has given this panel: Winston Churchill, hero and/or colonist. It seems to me that raises three questions. One is, was he a hero? He certainly lived a life of heroic proportion. And was he a colonialist? No doubt about it. But the slash in between and or is where the real question is. Could one be a hero and a colonialist as well? Churchill, most of what I'm going to do tonight is tell you what Churchill said about that. We can talk about what I think about that later if you want to. But Churchill is a very unusual man. He was an important man for 60 years. He wrote over 45 books. He wrote 8,000 pages of speeches. And so if you want to know what he claimed, there's a lot of it. And it exists on every subject, including this one. And I think to understand what Churchill thought about empire, what he said he thought about empire, you have to sort of understand that he placed it in a context of his whole understanding of politics, which in my opinion was rich, unusually rich. The parts are like this. Churchill was a liberal, that is to say, somebody who thought that people deserved to be free. I personally can find no place where Churchill said that anybody's qualification to be free depended upon their race or their color. He thought, like most thinkers, political thinkers have thought, that freedom is hard to get and hard to maintain. And it requires two main things. It requires devotion among a people to principles of freedom, and it requires forms of government that will sustain them as they deliberate together and delegate power to the government. That's a sort of modern understanding of constitutionalism, and when Churchill speaks of that, he sounds a lot like the Federalist Papers. That means the principles of freedom. He loved to say Magna Carta, the English Bill of Rights, and the Declaration of Independence are the three main title deeds of liberty. And when he talked of the British Constitution, it didn't have all of these features fully, but he actually many times in his life tried to incorporate them when they didn't exist. He thought that representation, which Britain was, and separation of powers and federalism were all important. And he made many major efforts to improve those things in Britain, most of which didn't get done, but he kept at it. He thought that in our time, there's a special problem with free government. And it's a special problem in both foreign and domestic policies, international relations, and politics at home. And I'm going to talk mostly about foreign policy and war because that is quickest to relate to empire. It was in 1897 that Churchill took part in a battle. Churchill lasted a long time, and also he went very fast, and he started fast. So by 1900, he had fought in 4 wars and written best-selling books about 3 of them. become famous, and then he got elected to Parliament. And he was reflective about those wars, especially what I regard as his best early book, The River War. And that's about a war in the Sudan against, and is one of the first Islamic republics. And the British won that war. It was a sort of war of vengeance for the British people, because this man who formed this Islamic Republic was called the Mahdi, and he had taken the town of Khartoum, which is 1,000 miles up the Nile from the mouth, and he had beheaded a British hero, a famous man named George Gordon, General Gordon, or Chinese Gordon, sort of exotic imperial warrior. And so everybody wanted to get their own back, but it wasn't easy, because they kept trying to get back down there to Khartoum on a camel corps with a camel corps, and they couldn't do it. They couldn't reach the place. And so a logistical general, Churchill didn't like him and had much to do with him in his life until he was killed in the middle of the First World War. Lord Kitchener did a novel thing. The Nile was too shallow to pass along a long stretch, about 2/3 of the way down toward Khartoum. And so what he did was he put a bunch of equipment on boats, and they were railway equipment and locomotives, and also guns and impedimenta of war, modern war. And he went down to the place where the boats couldn't go anymore, and he built a railroad, around the shallows. And then he loaded all the stuff up on the railway cars, the boats included, and he took them down past the shallows where it was deep enough for him to go. And he loaded everything back up on the boats. And then he had a modern mechanized army just south of Khartoum on a little place called Omdurman. And Churchill was, in this thing to make his career. He was a young man full of spit. And his books, all of them are like that, but never wholly like that. And this one, the least like that, because the dervishes charged across open ground, and they just got cut to pieces. And when Churchill writes about that, it's very moving. It's in the chapter called The Battle of Omdurman. And he refers to the dervishes several times as brave, and the British advantage is unfair. And then in one paragraph, he describes the British line, and he's describing a factory. These guns are machines, and they carry bullets to them, and they change the water jackets, and they fire volleys, and they notice that the enemy is getting somewhat nearer, but also fewer. In the end, and I think about 35,000 people were in the main charge, and the one who got the closest to the British line got 150 yards away, which means you couldn't see it very well. And the British were not, Churchill writes the sentence, it seemed unfair to strike them so cruelly when they had not hurt us at all. Churchill took a lesson from that. He began to write and wonder, what'll happen when two armies get together like that? And in 1901, he gave a speech predicting the First World War. He's a 1-year-in member of Parliament. And he said, the victors and the vanquished will be hard to distinguish. And he said that there was a political thing about this. And that is that free societies generate innovation and wealth. And those can be used to make war more terrible. And that means Churchill thought that free societies contained the seeds of their own destruction in that innovation. He had a similar line of thought about domestic politics too. And he wrote many things that sort of fit in a category with the first totalitarian novels with Arthur Koestler and George Orwell and stuff, and he was a reader of them, and he knew them. In 1925, he wrote an essay called "Shall We All Commit Suicide?" And it contains a paragraph that goes roughly, mankind has never been in this position before. Without improving wisely, without improving appreciably in virtue or enjoying wiser guidance, he's got into his hands at last the means of his own destruction. And that means that just as, by the way, liberal societies with their innovation and their wealth are productive of this, they're also unusually vulnerable to it, because what they depend upon, Churchill thought, was money being in private people's hands. The society is not to be a conscripted society, it's to be a free society. And people, he believed people would get to live fully human lives because of that. They could make their own livings and raise their own families and participate in the civic affairs of their community and their nation. But when a big war comes, everything gets socialized. And so come to find out, all his life, and it's amazing people don't know it. And the reason they don't know it is because when a war did come, Churchill's spirits rose, and he was good at war. He was a very brave soldier on the battlefield, and he was very steady and thoughtful and aggressive in council. But never mind, he was asked in the middle of the Second World War, what shall we call this war? And he said, that's easy. This is the unnecessary war. This could have been prevented. Now that means that the relations among nations are more dangerous than they have ever been, Churchill thought. And it's in that category that two things come up. One is Britain is an island, which Churchill thinks is a dispositive accident. Because, and apparently he thinks, I'm not even sure if it's true, that 10,000 years ago, Britain was not an island, but the sea rose. And because of that, it changed. The big continental powers, they had to have big armies because somebody's big army might come upon you anytime. But Britain didn't need that. They needed a navy. And navies can be very powerful, but they're not very good at oppressing domestic populations. And that's why he thought the conflict that went on in most of the continental countries between parliaments and kings sort of went the way of the parliament more frequently in Britain. And it became a liberal society. And then once you're a naval power, you know, the story of Athens versus Sparta, for example, naval powers are cosmopolitan. And once you get out on the ship, and the North Sea is a very tough place to navigate, once you get good at that, and there's no place in the British Isles that's more than 50 miles from the sea. Oxford, where I used to live, is such a place, 49 miles from the sea. It's the farthest of any place. And that meant that people got good at the sea. And then once you launch your boat out in the ocean, goodness, you can go anywhere. And the British went all over the world. They went mostly to trade. In their empire in North America and in Australia and such places, they sent families. They didn't send priests and soldiers, they sent families. And they ended up settling there. And the British gained a lot of influence there. And they didn't really, there wasn't a centuries-long project to build an empire. Churchill's account of it, which I think is at least partially true, is that they woke up and found that they had one. And he thought that that was very good. It made Britain strong, and those were free and self-governing countries. in the two world wars, somewhere between 40 and 45% of the British war effort was contributed by the imperial countries. And Britain didn't have the power to conscript any soldier in any of those countries. In India, they had some power like that, but India had an all-volunteer army. And so nobody who came from the empire, and the Indians contributed very many, 2.5 million in the Second World War, largest volunteer army in history. And so Britain got strong through association with countries that Britain had helped to found that had, for the most part, and the biggest and most important of them, self-governing institutions. Churchill loved to say that we learned how to run our empire by losing the American Revolutionary War. By it, we lost an empire, the one in North America, or in America, at least the United States. But by it, we also preserved an empire. And so he thought the empire was important. Now, India is the most important special case because India was not self-governing and he didn't think it should be at this time. I can find no place where he ever denied that they were fully capable of self-government. And indeed, there were practical plans which he helped to advance that went very far to involve Indians in their government. And according to the last plan he made before the war broke out, Indians would be entirely responsible for their government at the local level. He thought it mattered a lot about India and everywhere else, but especially about India, that Britain never set out to conquer India, he argued. It was actually taken by an employee of the British East India Company, Lord Clive, and he was not even trained as a soldier. And when he ended up, and there were French and Germans and English along the coast of India, and they were quarreling with each other quite a bit. And the Indian princes, who were very powerful people and had more subjects, Churchill liked to say, than the Queen of England, they were fighting with each other. And Clive, when his settlement was threatened, put together a coalition that basically got the mastery of English, of India, partly through war and partly through diplomacy. And that meant, and Churchill, he loved that story, and that's the way he told it, whether you agree with it or not. And he thought that that was good because that meant that they didn't go down there to subjugate those people. And yet they rather did. And he thought the Indian, and so there was a great conflict in the 1930s. And should India be given its independence? And Churchill thought, yes, definitely. He said that many times, eventually, but not now. And the reason not now is that the upper classes will dominate and be cruel to the lower classes, the untouchables especially, in ways that we help to moderate. And whether that's true or not, that's what he thought. And he even thought, and he argued this strongly, and I want to put the point that in the 1930s, he lost this argument. In other words, it carried a political cost for him, but he stuck to it anyway. And he said along the way that we have a duty there because the Indian population has grown. And there'll be more bloodshed and devastation if we leave than if we stay. But if we stay and help guide them toward free institutions, it'll be good for them. Now, that's not, of course, anything like fashionable today. That's a repellent talk to almost everybody. I will tell you that in 2005, a former prime minister of India published an article in the Wall Street Journal. He retired by then when he wrote it. He said that the West should come and trade here, because we have institutions like the West, representative institutions that make us more reliable and fair. And I didn't come here to argue that Britain gets credit for that. I might argue that, but not tonight. And I would partially argue that. But I will say, I think India is a nation of the first importance in the world today. And I read about it all the time. I've never been there and I want to go. I'm too busy and it's too far away, I guess. But my wife and I have a pact that we're going to go. It's our bucket list and it's the only item on it. And it's growing strength. Pray it continue. So Churchill thought that that was, in this complex of things he believed about the world, Churchill thought that the empire was important and that it had to be a liberal empire. In most cases, currently. Oh, it's an interesting fact about Churchill that I can't find any place that he ever proposed to add to the empire during his whole life. He was part of the faction that successfully resisted adding colonies to the empire. He thought our empire should be around the coast. And that's because the Navy can get there. And it's in great shape right now. We don't need any more. In the aftermath of the disastrous First World War, the Western allies of Britain and France and the United States won it. And the League of Nations, which didn't last very long, gave a mandate over certain territories to Britain. And Winston Churchill was placed in charge of the Colonial Office. And so one of the nations was Iraq. And Winston Churchill's number 2 in the Colonial Office was T.E. Lawrence of Arabia. And they agreed as a first step that they're going to get out of there as quick as we can. I once had a conversation with some people in the Bush White House. They were going to make a democracy in Iraq. And I said, well, what do I think about that? And I said, I hope you can do it. I bet it'll be hard. And they said, well, Churchill did that. And I said, well, as a matter of fact, I think the particular man I was talking to is a famous man and good man. And he's in a contest with some other people who were in that White House to read 5 books a week. And I said, I think you read them too fast. So Churchill had a humility about how fast you could make a democracy. And he thought, he argued, whatever he thought that the British had an obligation there. Now, he won his glory in the Second World War, which he endeavored to prevent and thought it a tragedy that he'd been unable to prevent it. And he also thought that the greatness of Great Britain would be compromised by that war, and it was. More even than the First World War, which reduced the strength of the British nation massively. And not just because it lost imperial possessions. So that's what he thought. And, it doesn't matter whether you like that or not. It's an important fact because the world is still a very dangerous place. In fact, more dangerous. And how are you going to organize it so one can be safe and trade and prosper and not kill each other by the millions? And so that's Winston Churchill on empire. I do think he was a hero. I think he won that title many ways, but especially on May the 28th, 1940, where he went into a cabinet meeting and the whole cabinet was getting ready to make a peace with Adolf Hitler. And Churchill was the one who understood the best that if we don't do that, it's probably going to reduce our nation to a smaller thing. And yet we just can't make an agreement with the Nazis. I think that was heroic. And he was a colonialist in the manner that I said. Thank you.
thank you, Dr. Arnn. And now, please join me in welcoming Professor McMeekin. Thank you for braving the wintry roads in from Bard College tonight, and maybe worse tomorrow, but hopefully it'll be okay. So thanks so much for being here. And by the way, I should just add, if you have questions, some of you are already doing this, please put them in the Q&A tab, and we'll hopefully get to some of those after the presentations.
Thank you, Dr. Sears, for the kind introduction. Thank you, Dr. Arnn, for the interesting remarks, and I look forward to Dr. Mukherjee's presentation. Unfortunately, we're not all in the same room together. It would have been wonderful if we could have been. However, hopefully we can still get an interesting and productive conversation going by a kind of synergy. It was a long drive today, I have to say, though. I have an English colleague at Bard who likes to say, and I'm a little tired of this joke personally, but most of you probably won't have heard it before, so I'll try your patience. That the thing about the English is that they, well, I'll start with the thing about the Americans is that they think 100 years is a long time, whereas the British think that 100 miles is a long way to drive. But in fact, no, it's, for me, it's nothing. I've driven cross country 6 times, so this was a short kind of jaunt in the woods. Well, I'm glad that Dr. Arnn kind of ended with the Second World War, because I think that's where I want to end as well. But I should preface this by saying that, unlike the other 2 speakers tonight, I'm not really a Churchill scholar as such, a Churchill expert, someone who's kind of written about Churchill, with Churchill, let's say, in the title of the book. Somehow, though, amazingly, he's made his way into all of my books. I've done 8 of them, and he's in all 8 of them, which I think is kind of an interesting testament to just the largeness and the variety, and to some extent, the astonishing boldness of Churchill's career. You know, if you're going to write about anything from, I guess we were hearing earlier about Omdurman and Kitchener of Khartoum in the late 19th century, on through the early Cold War and the speech in Fulton, Missouri, and nearly all of the major geopolitical points in between, there he is. I used to tell my students he was a bit like a Forrest Gump of the first half of the 20th century. Now, unfortunately, I'm getting so much older, I'm not sure if students today have actually seen Forrest Gump. Perhaps some of them have. One of the running kind of leitmotifs or jokes of the movie is that he's present for all these key moments in history. He's there during the Watergate break-ins, and he's there for opening of China with ping pong diplomacy, Vietnam, kind of hippies. He meets the Black Panthers. It's kind of this running joke in the movie. And Churchill's a little bit like that. I mean, it really is astonishing when you think about all of the critical moments that he either witnessed or participated in, or in some cases, of course, brought into being. So you can't write the history of the First World War, for example, without grappling intensely with Churchill. I mean, sometimes my students are shocked to learn that they've heard about Churchill in the Second World War. They didn't realize he was there at the beginning of the First World War, too. That to some extent, he was even personally responsible for bringing the Ottoman Empire into the First World War. Again, allegedly. There are a lot of serial charges laid against Churchill. His career is not only prolific, it's also, of course, controversial. And over the years, I have developed, maybe not a broad kind of ecumenical holistic expertise in Churchill's career, but rather certain moments that I've investigated very deeply. And perhaps it's my natural contrarian, but I tend to disagree with nearly everyone else about most of the key moments in Churchill's career, whether for good or for evil, not necessarily evil, but that is to say whether I think he had it right or he had it wrong. I'm often at odds with the consensus. Before I get to the Second World War, which to some extent is really kind of the origin and probably the inspiration for the talk, again, the book's actually about Stalin, but Churchill, of course, is all over the place in the book. When I started investigating Churchill in the First World War, I had heard some of the stories. The bit about the Ottoman Empire, see what happened was that there were these 2 state-of-the-art dreadnoughts. A dreadnought was effectively this old big gun battleship, first launched HMS Dreadnought 1906, revolutionized naval warfare. Everyone wanted them, not everyone could build them. Britain was building 2 for the Ottoman Navy, and there was a whole kind of waiting game in the Eastern Mediterranean involving Greece and even Russia and the Black Sea and the Ottomans when those dreadnoughts would arrive. They never did arrive because Churchill commandeered them. Interestingly, it was a personal decision. It was not apparently even cleared with the cabinet. He commandeered them because he thought Britain might need them for the war against Germany. which he still thought, like everyone else, might be over in a couple of months, so they might play a kind of decisive role. Now, this is not the only reason the Ottoman Empire entered the war. It did, however, play a really dramatic role in the lead up to the Ottoman entry into the war, which, among other things, of course, ended up at the cataclysm and the decline and fall and collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the birth of the modern Middle East, with all of its various headaches. The other moment Churchill is really notorious for in the First World War, and this is where the myths die so hard. It's really amazing. Just a couple of months ago, a friend of mine did a new book on the Western Front in the First World War. He fought on the Western Front too, by the way. So he did a book on the Western Front in the war, but just as a kind of throwaway line, I believe it was Max Hastings, eminent British military historian, repeated this old canard about how Churchill was to blame for the British trying to force their way through the Dardanelles. This is what would eventually become the Gallipoli campaign, to try to open up the Ottoman Straits, basically to Russia, so Russia could import arms and other things that she needed to fight the war against the Central Powers. Well, curiously, again, the line that he repeated, which everyone has been repeating now for really over a century, is that Churchill is somehow to blame for the fact that they tried to push through just with the Navy without having ground troops available, which was not Churchill's fault. It was actually Kitchener who told Churchill, who was First Lord of the Admiralty, who had no responsibility for the army. Churchill asked, "Can I have troops?" And Kitchener said, "No, you can't have troops." So you see, it wasn't Churchill's fault. The reason Churchill later took the blame for the whole campaign, which turned into a bloody debacle, one of really the great kind of debacles of British military history, is largely because, amazingly, the British government, they convened these parliamentary hearings a couple of years later. It's a bit like what Congress does sometimes when they want to investigate some subject and grill people and make them squirm. They were called the Dardanelles Commission hearings. And Kitchener got off the hook simply because he had died at sea a couple of months previously, and so no one got to question him. And so instead, everyone lit into Churchill. It certainly wasn't Churchill's fault. On the other hand, curiously enough, the one thing everyone tries to praise Churchill for in the Gallipoli campaign, I think they also get wrong. This is an interesting one, which I think it might originate in one of the early Churchill biographies, but it was made particularly famous in a best-selling book about 30 years ago by David Fromkin called A Peace to End All Peace. Effectively, the argument was this, that even though they didn't start with troops, they could have actually pushed on and broken through at the Dardanelles and opened up the straits to Russia in 1915 had the Navy been allowed to do its work, which is what Churchill was actually trying to do. The argument then becoming, Russia's opened up, the Central Powers are effectively surrounded, British blockade, Russia's back in full vigor, the First World War ends in 1915, so therefore you don't get 3 more years of bloody war, US entry into the war, the rise of communism after the Russian Revolution, fascism, all the nightmare debacles of the middle years of the 20th century don't happen. And Churchill became obsessed with this line. He wrote about it in many of his books. A lot of Churchill's biographers took up this cudgel, and they've been arguing ever since that had Churchill been right, and had they pushed on after the March 18th battle, this is when they lost 6 ships of the line in one bloody day, when they called off the naval-only campaign and waited for the ground troops. Well, anyway, the line being that, had they pushed on, they might have ended the war in 1915, and all history would have been different afterwards. And Churchill based his whole argument on this intercepted communication, where it turned out that the Germans who were supplying the Ottomans, apparently there was a panicky message that they were running out of ammunition for all of their howitzers and their shore guns and so on. Now, it turns out Churchill was completely wrong about this. This was actually just a kind of, I discovered this because I investigated the Ottoman and the German files. It was just an ordinary request for resupply. They weren't actually running out of ammunition, nor was their morale about to collapse because they had just seen 6 enemy ships sink to the bottom of the straits. And in fact, they were all celebrating and cheering. March 18th is actually a national holiday in Turkey today, I discovered. So it turns out he was actually totally wrong about that. On the other hand, everyone else was completely wrong when they blamed him for the campaign. The thing you have to give Churchill, he took strong positions. He wasn't always right, but he definitely had courage. So that after he was blamed and raked through the coals by the Dardanelles Commission and basically singled out as the one scapegoat for this disastrous military campaign, which wasn't really his fault, and a lot of people said, well, you have sacrificed all these men's lives in vain and treated them like cannon fodder. What did you do? He took a commission and he went and he actually fought on the Western Front, in the Charnage House of the Western Front. And of course, his career wasn't over. He returns, he's Minister of War and Munitions at the end of the war. He's in the cabinet when Britain is deciding what to do about the Russian Revolution, whether to intervene in the Russian Civil War. Of course, there too, he took a passionate side. He thought Britain should intervene on the side of the so-called whites in the Russian Civil War. And in the end, he didn't get his way. Prime Minister Lloyd George effectively overruled him, although Britain did intervene. She then kind of cut the legs out from under the intervention. And he protested that too. And he was quite angry that Britain had kind of sold out the whites and ended the blockade and given up on the cause just when it seemed like the whites were on the cusp of victory in fall 1919. He returns to Ottoman affairs as well. He argues in the cabinet that Britain had taken the wrong position in both of the major wars that grew out of the First World War. The Russian Civil War, where he thought basically that Britain should have sided with the whites much more decisively. And then the Greco-Turkish War, as the Turks call it, the Turkish War of Independence, where he thought that Britain had actually gotten entangled with Mustafa Kemal, later Ataturk, and should not have actually been quite so hostile to the emerging Turkish nationalists. Curiously enough, he later changed his mind about that too, right at the very end, when the Turkish armies actually started to threaten, of all places, Gallipoli, the Gallipoli Peninsula. He changed his mind, and then suddenly he was, full in war cry, saying that Britain should go to war. Lloyd George was in full agreement, but the rest of the British people had by then tired of war. And so they actually took down the Lloyd George government, and he never returned to office. Strangely enough, Churchill and Lloyd George reappear in history in a very particular way that's not generally especially well known. It's known that Churchill had these kind of wilderness years in the 1930s. To some extent, again, his reputation had been tarnished by Gallipoli. It had also been tarnished, there's a great Forrest Gump moment. For a while, he actually, believe it or not, he even had a job for a while as the Chancellor of the Exchequer. So he was effectively finance minister, something he didn't really have a whole lot of experience in. In fact, he was so bad at it that he lost pretty much his entire fortune in the Wall Street crash of 1929. But this is several years before that. He was actually Chancellor of the Exchequer when Britain went back onto the gold standard in 1925. And again, the usual argument here is that this was a colossal mistake that led to, among other things, deflation, kind of industrial collapse, mass unemployment, and all the rest of it. I happen to have investigated this one too a little bit, and I think the consensus is kind of half right. It was not a mistake necessarily to go back on the gold standard. However, they did so at the old rate to the dollar, even though the pound had actually weakened against the dollar, which meant ipso facto it was deflationary. Effectively, this meant that Britain was going to have a major unemployment crisis. So by the 30s, his reputation, it wasn't in tatters exactly, but he was kind of a little bit radioactive. People remembered Gallipoli. They were still telling the same old, basically wrong story about Churchill being to blame for that. A lot of people remembered Britain going back on the gold standard, which didn't end well. So yes, he kind of has these wilderness years. And it's well known, he takes this stand against Chamberlain, vis-a-vis the Munich conference. Chamberlain kind of famously says he has won, of course, peace for our time by appeasing Hitler over the Czech Sudetenland. And Churchill says, no, you have chosen war. And he's right. He's one of Churchill's great prophecies. A man of great opinions, also, of course, very eloquent. He had a way of expressing these things. But Churchill and Lloyd George, they kind of reemerge in a very interesting way late in 1939. In the way that history has often been said, history doesn't necessarily always rhyme. It doesn't repeat itself, but it often does rhyme. At the Second World War, when it breaks out in September 1939, Churchill had been out of the cabinet. I mean, to some extent, even bringing him in. He was so famously bellicose in his rhetoric about Hitler and Nazi Germany, the Nazi threat. Part of the reason they had kept him out of the cabinet was that had they brought him in, this would have been basically interpreted by Hitler and the German government as almost like a declaration of war. Once the war begins, of course, the German invasion of Poland, and a few weeks after that, the Soviet invasion of Poland, everyone forgets about after Hitler and Stalin had signed their pact, usually misnamed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in August 1939. They bring Churchill right back into the government. Amazingly, they give him his old job, First Lord of the Admiralty. It's the same job he had in 1914. So he even begins the two world wars with the same job. Now, how does he do? I mean, it's interesting that although naval affairs, the naval brief, this is kind of his métier. He is, of course, such an old hand at politics, at geopolitics, that he immediately takes a hand. And here's where I think the first really interesting moment where I begin to, again, diverge a little bit from the traditional Churchill narrative is that after the Soviets invade Poland on September 17th, 1939, the Red Army, again, the invasion most people kind of forget because they know about the Nazis invading, well, actually from 5 different directions, because they also had East Prussia, it was a massive 5-pronged invasion. The Soviets effectively had waited until, and they actually told the Germans this. They said, look, we're not really going to help you. We're going to wait until Warsaw has fallen, and so Poland has ceased to exist, and then we're going to invade. And the way they put it to the Polish ambassador once they called him in Moscow, this is on the 17th of September 1939, your country no longer exists, so you're now under arrest. And they sent him to a gulag camp. Kind of shocking. On the other hand, a little bit forgotten, because after all, the Germans were the ones who had kind of done most of the damage, and we have the famous Stuka dive bombers and the terror bombing from the air. That's what all the news headlines are screaming about. But here come the Russians. They invade Poland from the east. The Russian share, the Soviet share, was actually supposed to be larger than the German share, although they ended up having to renegotiate because the Germans crossed the demarcation lines. So they actually had to do a swap where the Germans got the middle of Poland and the Russians got Lithuania. Well, this is all pretty shocking. On the other hand, it's also kind of a difficult diplomatic problem for Britain and France, who've declared war on Nazi Germany, but effectively not really done anything to help Poland. Dropped a few propaganda leaflets, half-hearted invasion of Germany near Saarbrücken, nothing really happens. They haven't really helped Poland. Now, Churchill, mind you, had nothing to do with that. I mean, this is Chamberlain shows. Churchill's just First Lord of the Admiralty. But what Britain can't quite figure out at this stage of the war is, first of all, they haven't really figured out how to even fight Nazi Germany yet. And they don't want to take on another opponent either. So in fact, they had a secret agreement inside the agreement with France vis-a-vis Poland, that even though they said they were going to defend Poland against an aggressor, they stipulated that it had to be a European power. I guess they believed, like the Slavophiles of Russia, that Russia was not really European, so Russia didn't count. They didn't want to go to war with Russia, which is understandable. That would be taking on yet another large enemy. But it was kind of difficult because both countries were invading Poland, and outside of Britain and France, a lot of other people in Europe had kind of noticed. The neutral powers had noticed. It was a little strange that Britain and France had declared war on only one power invading Poland. Now here's where Churchill, and Lloyd George, to be fair to Churchill, did it first. He actually went into the press and he published an editorial basically saying, well, look, the Soviets hadn't really invaded Poland after all. Remember, they were our allies in the last war, and all they had really done was taken land that used to belong to them. Which is a pretty strange thing to argue, because of course the whole premise of German territorial irredentism was that the Germans were trying to take territory that used to belong to them, such as Danzig, the Polish quarter, the Sudetenland, in the case of Austria, etc. But yeah, you kind of get where he's coming from. Churchill then goes even further and basically says it's actually in Britain's interest for the Soviets to move into Poland and to reconstitute something like her old borders. The thing about Churchill, again, is he had this very rich imagination, historical imagination, political imagination. He was, of course, immensely learned, brilliant speaker, brilliant writer. And he's often thinking in terms of history. So curiously enough, at a time when Stalin and Hitler were collaborating in carving up Poland, and they would shortly collaborate in carving up the rest of Eastern Europe, Stalin's going to move into Finland, the Baltic countries, Romania. He's still thinking in terms of the Russia of the First World War, the brotherhood in arms. In fact, this is one of Churchill's, to some extent, stumbling blocks later in the war, when he keeps trying to think about Poland and what to do vis-a-vis Poland. The problem is that a lot of Poles were on the other side of the First World War too. So even though he is, in general, in principle, in theory, a supporter of the cause of Poland, he finds it hard to really embrace the Poles. Now, vis-a-vis Stalin, it's a little bit different. It's not that he admires Stalin. He had been a principled anti-communist. Remember, he had wanted to intervene against the Bolsheviks, against the communists in the Russian Civil War. However, he still sees Russia geopolitically as a counterweight to Nazi Germany. And so he actually goes on record and argues in the cabinet that he thinks that basically he doesn't use the word aggression, but he says the expansion of Soviet power and influence in the Baltic region should be encouraged. So he does not take a stand against the Soviet moves into the Baltic countries or into Poland, or even to some extent when the Soviets invade Finland on November 30th, 1939. Now, his hand is almost forced, curiously enough, because after the Soviets invade Finland, Britain comes almost perilously close to going to war with the Soviet Union in early 1940. In fact, Britain even, believe it or not, they conducted surveillance overflights of the Soviet oil installations, Baku and Batumi in the Trans-Caucasus. So Britain came perilously close. This is in the last months of Chamberlain, before Churchill takes office in Downing Street, May 1940. Britain came perilously close to going to war with the Soviets in March and April of 1940. However, she didn't. And to some extent, Hitler, of course, preempted that possibility with his invasion of first Denmark, Norway in April, and then France and the Low Countries in May 1940. And this is when Churchill really does kind of meet his moment. And I think Dr. Arndt is absolutely right that Churchill did genuinely face cabinet opposition. There was a lot of sentiment in favor of negotiating an agreement with Hitler, with Nazi Germany, which would have preserved the British Empire. And here's where I think we get to the real crux of kind of Churchill and his legacy. Not to say that what's going on in India or in Africa or in the Middle East and the British Empire, all of those things matter greatly. But when you talk about Churchill, his legacy, what he stood for, obviously this whole story of standing up to Nazi Germany is central to the story. And it was a choice. And it was a choice he and Britain did not have to make. It was a choice that came with a price. And the price wasn't just a kind of ultimate diminution of Britain into something like a junior partner, really a very junior partner of the United States in the post-war world. Effectively, it was, in the end, a kind of decision to sacrifice the British Empire, which he actually did love and he did believe in. Among other things, when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941, Churchill almost immediately, almost beside himself with glee, he had wanted this all along. He had wanted Stalin and Hitler to break and to go to war. He had been actively angling for this. In fact, Stalin kind of suspected that Churchill had somehow tried to bring this whole thing about. His initial reaction was not just one of diplomatic support for Stalin, but material support. Most famously, he sends 200 Hawker Hurricane fighters. This is the workhorse of the RAF. It had done the bulk of the work in the Battle of Britain in 1940. He sends them to Stalin instead of to Singapore, which shortly falls, of course, to Japan. He sends tanks, including American tanks and Lend-Lease tanks and motorized vehicles, and American bombers, the Douglas A-20 Havoc bombers, which had been promised to Britain under Lend-Lease, reconsigns them to Stalin. He deprives the Egyptian command, the Cairo command of tanks in 1942, the tanks which actually end up helping the Russians defend Stalingrad. He sends Stalin aluminum, processed aluminum, which was critically important in the production of warplanes. In the Soviet case, the production of tanks as well. The Soviets needed it even more desperately than the British did. So Churchill agreed to send nearly 3,000 tons a month of processed aluminum to Stalin, effectively consigning the British aircraft production, the British Air Force, to kind of second-class status. Now, some of this probably would have happened in the end on its own. But he also then has to endure the torture, you might call it, almost this kind of strategic and diplomatic torture, when they go to Tehran in November 1943. And after going all out and essentially selling out British imperial interests, selling out the future of the British Air Force, selling out Britain's imperial interests from Singapore to Egypt to the needs of the Red Army, Churchill is forced to endure as Roosevelt not just insults him to his face, winks at Stalin, I mean literally winks at Stalin at the conference, takes Stalin's position on almost every question of importance regarding Allied priorities, particularly in Europe. Here is where, once again, I think I should probably start to wind this up here, because I think I've been going on nearly 20 minutes. The consensus view is that Churchill, despite his kind of heroic and moral qualities as a leader, supposedly always got strategy wrong. And so we've always heard about this idea of the underbelly, the strategic underbelly of Europe. The origin of the story was a meeting between Churchill and Stalin in Moscow, where Churchill supposedly was using the example of, I think, a crocodile, and saying like, well, here you have like the hard snout in the back, and then you have the soft underbelly, and that's where if you're Crocodile Dundee, you would attack the crocodile. So that's supposed to be the Mediterranean, Italy, perhaps the Adriatic, perhaps the Balkans. And so the usual view, again, is that Churchill, despite his moral qualities, his great leadership, his principles, didn't understand geopolitics. I actually think it's 180 degrees wrong. Churchill was emphatically right about the Mediterranean strategy in 1943, and Roosevelt sold him down the river. It is rather, because I just want to end with this thought. I don't have enough time to go into detail. I'd be happy to answer questions about what I mean about the Mediterranean strategy, but we always hear about the special relationship between the British and the Americans. Well, from the perspective of Churchill and the British, the story of the Second World War is essentially that of mortgaging the empire to the United States. You go back to the basis destroyers deal, 1940, extortionate terms, Lend-Lease extortionate terms. Britain was paying off wartime loans with interest until 2006, whereas the US not only sent Stalin everything he wanted with no money due up front, they settled for 2 pennies on the dollar in 1951, and the Russians never had to pay any of it back. The US bankrupted Britain, and Roosevelt enjoyed doing it. So that I think the real irony, and if one wants to take Churchill's side in these questions, the tragedy of it is that he was a man fiercely devoted to, if you want to call it colonialism, empire, what have you. I fully agree, he believed in it. And yet he made decisions during the war which led inevitably to the collapse of the British Empire. And perhaps the price was worth paying, in which case, then he is a hero. I think I'll wrap things up there.
Thanks so much, Professor McMeekin. And I'll just remind everyone that we have the Q&A tab here if you'd like to ask any questions. And we also are, I believe, recording the session tonight. So people who would like to watch again or catch parts of it that you may have missed, we'll be circulating the link to the recording as well. So, but thanks again so much. And finally, we'll hear from Dr. Mukherjee, who joins us from early morning in India. Thank you so much for being with us so early from your place, half a globe away or a globe away. I don't know. It's pretty far across many time zones. So thank you for joining us. Let's please welcome Dr. Mukherjee.
Thanks so much, Dr. Sievers, for inviting me, and thanks to Drs. Arnn and Meekin for these very enjoyable talks. I will be using slides, so bear with me while I share them with you. Unfortunately, my screen sharing is disabled. Could someone turn that on? But while that's turned on, I will start talking. It looks to me like my role is to describe Churchill's imperialism, and not only that, let me just blow this up. Looks to me like my role is to describe Churchill's imperialism, and not only that, but to show what it actually meant for the people of the empire. So I'm going to start with World War II because that's what he's most famous for. And I'm finding that I'm not able to change my screen. Give me a second. So World War II is usually seen as a war often seen as a war between the free world and the great evil of fascism. And as Dr. Meekin has pointed out, it was more complicated than that. There was a third actor in there, communism under Stalin, which couldn't be described as essentially benign. But what I want to do is to describe to you World War II as seen by imperial subjects, specifically India, and it's fitting that I'm joining you now from India. So this is a map of India during World War II. This is British India, and it reached all the way from Iran in the west to Burma in the east. And I will mostly be talking about this eastern province of Bengal, where I am now. And British India has since, of course, been divided into India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. So from this point of view, the war was between three forces, none of which were benign. One was imperialism, represented by Churchill. Another was fascism, represented by Hitler. And the third was communism, represented by Stalin. And I'm going to try and explain to you in the short time I have why it is difficult for imperial subjects to see imperialism as a benign force. So just to recap a little bit about the history of India during British rule. India was conquered by the East India Company in several battles beginning in 1757. Eventually in 1857, the reins were handed over to the British Crown. During this period, India's entire economy was turned over for British use. So for example, the loot that came from India in the late 18th century, that played a big role in in providing capital for the Industrial Revolution. Moreover, India's manufacturing industry, which India had at that time roughly a quarter of the world's GDP, and a lot of that was exports from weaving, was deliberately destroyed and turning India into a captive market for British goods from the new spinning mills, for example. India's GDP completely collapsed. During the period of 2 centuries, almost 2 centuries, that India was a British colony, an Indian economist, Utsa Patnaik, has calculated that it extracted 45 trillion pounds from British India. And the way this happened was that once all the gold and jewelry and everything was gone, India began to export, and its manufacturers were destroyed. India began to export raw materials, the produce of its fields, things like cotton, wheat, opium for selling at gunpoint to China. And it was calculated that India was exporting by the end of the Victorian era enough grain to feed 25 million, enough grain, the value of which would feed 25 million people per year. Throughout the Victorian era, famines racked India, killing at least 25 million people in the Victorian era alone. In 1896, Churchill traveled to India as a young cavalryman. And he had a most marvelous time shooting snipe in the marshes, as he described, and Bucknell tribesmen at the northwest frontier. And he pledged to devote his life to the protection of this great empire of ours. And he had a keen realization of England's high mission to rule these primitive but agreeable races for our welfare and his own. Now, Churchill's imperial heritage came in significant part from his father, Lord Randolph Churchill, who had been the Secretary of State for India. And he had urged British parliamentarians to take good care of India, the most truly bright and precious gem in the crown of the Queen, the possession of which had raised in power and resource, in wealth and in authority. This small island home of ours perhaps placed it even in a position of superiority over every other empire, either of ancient or modern times. And what he was referring to was that the British Empire was the largest that the world had ever known. It was said that the sun never set on the British Empire, and someone quit because God doesn't trust an Englishman in the dark. On his way to the northwest frontier, Churchill stopped at a military encampment where he and fellow officers sang this rousing song about the great white mother across the sea, which is of course Britain. And he said it filled him with noble sentiments. So here are a few quotes that speak to what we would nowadays call Churchill's social Darwinism. This is a view in which the races are ordered in a hierarchy, with superior races like the British being right on top, and inferior races like the Indians being at the bottom. And this was a combination of Darwin and Malthus, who said that people must necessarily die if they don't produce enough food. Of course, Malthus was writing before the production and export of grain became possible. In fact, Britain was came to be sustained over the colonial period by massive food imports, especially during World War II. That becomes a big issue. But what we see from these quotes is that to Churchill, the destruction of superfluous millions was inconsequential. But at the same time, he believed that if India was lost to the British Empire, then a third of Britain's population would die of hunger, which is of course not what actually happened. But he felt that Britain was not only important to the wealth and prestige of the United Kingdom, but to its survival. And here's another quote that speaks more directly to the Darwinian pyramid. The British lion, fierce and valiant, etc., can now be chased by rabbits. By rabbits, he means Indians. And this is part of his campaign against Indian self-government in the 1930s. At that time, the Indian nationalist movement had intensified, and British politicians were working on a constitution for India, of course, in which Indians had no say. And what they wanted to do is, and I quote, is yield some facade of power so that elected Indian ministers would have minor portfolios like education and agriculture. But the real power, like things like defense, finance, foreign affairs, would be held by the Viceroy of India and the governors in the provinces. Churchill's views on India were so vehement that he ended up alienating the leaders of his own Tory party, and this contributed to his wilderness years that Sean referred to. So here's a somewhat mischievous view of World War II from a rabbit. It was a war among three predators. Of course, Churchill described Stalin as a crocodile, which is very apt. And he described Hitler as a boa. But the British were always the lions. So from the rabbit's point of view, it doesn't really matter who's eating you. So World War II begins in India. And India was destined to become a very important source for supplies for the British Empire. But the Indian National Congress, which was the main nationalist party at the time, demanded to know what the aims of the war were. If it included freedom and independence for India and democracy, then the Congress party said it would gladly support the war. But if it didn't, it had no reason to support a war that it saw as being among imperial powers. Of course, Churchill was the one who was heading the largest empire, but Hitler wanted his empire to the east, and he repeatedly described Russia as our India. His inspiration was the British Empire. But what happened was that Winston Churchill was not yet Prime Minister. He was Lord of the Admiralty, and his views on India were so vehement that the Viceroy ended up issuing a completely non-committal statement that said nothing about freedom for India, even after the war. In May 1940, Churchill became Prime Minister, and he appointed a Tory politician and imperialist Leopold Amery as the Secretary of State for India. Amery wanted to ensure that Indians provided their full support to the war effort. And he proposed that India be promised Dominion status after the war. That's what Canada and Australia had. And Churchill said he would sooner give up political life at once. So think about this. He is Prime Minister. This is a post that he's aspired to his entire life. And he's saying he would rather give it up than admit of any step that meant India becoming not part of the empire. So here are some quotes, famous quotes of his from the war, in which I highlight sections that show that the empire was always one of the reasons for which he was fighting the war. But things aren't so simple. In early 1942, the war reaches India's border. After Pearl Harbor, the Japanese forces just smashed through British defenses in the Far East. They conquer Burma, and British, everyone's terrified that they will conquer India, including Indians, of course. At this time, India is completely undefended because its 7 battalions, best armed and trained battalions, are fighting the Nazis and the Italians around the Mediterranean Sea. There was not a single bomber or a fighter plane, nothing. So Churchill had ordered a scorched earth policy, and Amory and Linlithgow, that's the Secretary of State for India and the Viceroy, they worked out the details. British officials went around destroying rice and transport along the coastline of Bengal. Tens of thousands of tons of rice were dumped into the river, and all transport was destroyed, which crippled the local economy. In August 1942, the Indian National Congress announced a civil disobedience movement. I should say that in between there was an interlude in which Roosevelt he wanted to make sure too that Indians participated in the war effort. And he had persuaded Churchill to make some kind of an offer to the Indians. Now the war cabinet in London put in it what Amory described as the Pakistan cuckoo's egg, saying that there would be essentially a possibility of partition after the war. And this was done specifically so the Indian National Congress would reject this offer that Churchill had been forced to make. Of course, it did reject the offer, and they'd embarked on a civil disobedience movement. This is an opportunity that Linlithgow, everybody had been waiting for. Immediately, all of the Indian National Congress leaders were arrested. Over the next year or so, there'd be 10,000 Indians killed, strafing of crowds by fighter planes, etc. 90,000 arrested. 105 battalions, these were armed men who were amassing in India for an upcoming offensive against Japan, were deployed against essentially unarmed civilians by May 1943. We've got them on the run, Churchill exulted. So what I should say is that it is difficult to avoid the impression when you look at Churchill's, the things that Churchill said and did at this time, that when he became prime minister, and he was the most powerful prime minister that the United Kingdom had ever had, he also held a defense portfolio. He was determined to use that power to finally implement the hardline policy on India that he had always wanted to. But Churchill's rage against Indians was not diminished. That's because at Roosevelt's urging, he had been forced to make an offer of Dominion status, and he felt that the US would be breathing down British necks after the war to make good on that promise. Meanwhile, famine is looming. And I have listed here a few of the main causes. So India would end up supplying 2 billion pounds worth of equipment and food and so on to the war effort. Of that, it would be owed eventually 1 billion pounds by the United Kingdom. But while the war lasted, the Indian government paid for this effort by printing paper money. The money supply increased by 6 or 7 times. And it went into the war production centers, and it sucked out all food from the villages. So that was a big cause of the famine. Scorched earth policies I've already mentioned, food exports despite shortages. Now, when Japan reached India's border, that had cut off an import of between 1 and 2 million tons of rice that fed Bengal's poor every year. That import was no longer possible. At the same time, India continued to be forced to export food grains, exporting 465,000 tons in this fiscal year at a period when war had actually arrived on India's borders. And to understand the contrast with the United Kingdom, you have to see how the United Kingdom prepared for war long before it had, years before it had actually broken out. Out of this export, 260,000 tons was rice. And this export continued at Churchill's personal insistence. Even as famine looms, the Viceroy asked for an import of 600,000 tons of wheat that would feed the army, which was buying that amount of wheat in India. At this time, India is the center of a huge military buildup. By end of 1944, there would be 2 million soldiers. Americans were flying supplies over the Eastern Himalayas to China. So all of this activity is in Eastern India, exactly where there is a famine looming. And Linlithgow wanted this amount of wheat to take the army off the backs of the people. He ended up getting 30,000 tons by about May 1943. That is 5% what he had asked for. Churchill insisted on a hard line with food shipments to India, while also insisting that India continue to export rice. By mid-1943, famine was raging. On August 4th, there was a war cabinet meeting in which Amory presented the Viceroy's urgent plea for 500,000 tons of wheat. Now, what does it mean when famine is raging? It means that people in the thousands are dragging themselves out of the villages, and they're dying on the pavements of Calcutta, which was the center of the war effort at that time in India. And that's very bad for army morale, because Calcutta was where soldiers went for when they had leave. And they had to step over corpses when they went into nightclubs. And they were actually starting to feed the people with their own rations because they were so outraged at what they were seeing. So this was a matter of army morale. And the Viceroy was supported by all of the generals that were in India at the time, but the War Cabinet turned it down. In fact, at this meeting, the War Cabinet scheduled not a single shipment of food for India, although wheat was available in Australia. Instead, Churchill ordered the buildup of a stockpile of food in the Middle East to supply Europe after it was liberated. This had to do with recap of the Dardanelles affair that Sean talked about earlier. So shiploads of wheat bypass starving India, and they're destined not for consumption, but for stockpile. The problem with Indians was that they were breeding like rabbits, Churchill raged in November 1943. At this meeting, the War Cabinet did schedule about 80,000 tons of wheat for India. But the food shortage came to an end at the end of 1943, when Bengal harvested its own rice crop, at which point Churchill and Cherwell, his advisor, started insisting again that India resume exporting rice. But deaths from disease continued for another year. Famine death toll was 3 million by most estimates. It could have been higher. It's just very difficult to calculate these things. Just to compare the United Kingdom's imports in 1943, and this is what it means to be a lion as opposed to being a rabbit. The United Kingdom received 27 million tons of food and raw materials during 1943. Such things as 1.1 million gallons of wine, 130,000 tons of tea, which came from India, in fact. By December 1943, the United Kingdom had reached the highest total ever. One reason for this stockpile was that, of course, to feed Britain, but more than that, whatever left over could be sold at high prices to liberated Europe after the war was over. So the United Kingdom was hoarding and speculating food. In 1945, Churchill told his secretary that the Hindus were a foul race protected by their pullulation. Pullulation means rapid breeding. So we are protected by our rapid breeding from the doom that is our due. He wished that Bomber Harris could send some of his surplus bombers to destroy them. India and Pakistan became independent in 1947. And I will stop here. Let me just see how to stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mukherjee. And we'll have time for questions now. And maybe we can put both of our virtual speakers up on the screen here. And Dr. McMeekin, maybe you can come up to the table here. And let's see, Josh, are you? Is Josh here? Okay. We'll be monitoring the Q&A tab, but maybe we can start with, actually, you know, I could ask the panelists if it's all right with you to start. If you might have a question or comment for each other, we can start with that. And then we can move to Q&A from the live audience, and then also check the tab online if that's all right. And you know, if y'all would rather, we can go to questions from the audience. But first, you know, we had three really substantive perspectives on Churchill's legacy from you know, different different perspectives, quite different. And maybe you might have a comment or a thought for each other if we could start with that.
Sure, I suppose Dr. Mukherjee is, I was trying to get correct, Mukherjee. I want to make sure I'm pronouncing it correctly. It's something I had thought about from that perspective. The Roosevelt-Churchill relationship is something that I've always been really interested in. And I suppose to some extent in this book, I come down a little bit more from the angle of trying to explain how much pressure Roosevelt was putting on Churchill in terms of financial pressure, leverage. I hadn't thought about it necessarily in the positive way, though. That is to say that that he was trying to get Churchill, I suppose, to take a lack of a better word, a less overtly colonialist and domineering position vis-a-vis India, looking at autonomy and all of that. I think it's a really interesting relationship because the closer you look at it, the less friendly it appears. That is Roosevelt and Churchill. You know, there's huge tension between them in all kinds of questions, and India is definitely one of them. It was just something that particularly struck me there. That I guess maybe he got Churchill at times to make concessions, probably not genuine ones. But it was something I was interested to hear a little bit more about. Is Dr. Arn here as well?
Yeah, I think we're getting
oh, okay,
on the screen as well.
But yeah, anyway, thank you for a wonderful talk from which I learned a lot and gave me a lot to think about.
Yeah, I wonder, did the United States represent a kind of fourth element there or not? I don't know if so, you know, with the triangle that we were seeing with imperialism and fascism and communism there. I don't know if that follows from your question.
Well, it's an interesting way of looking at it. You're right, that maybe not at the beginning of the war, when the US, of course, is studiedly neutral, but by the end of the war, the US clearly has emerged in this position that, on the one hand, helping to fuel the Soviet war effort, on the other hand, pressuring Britain with increasingly severity towards the end of the war into effectively mortgaging the empire, you know, in such a way where the US doesn't replace it literally, but the US absorbs many of the old responsibilities of the British Empire. And one hopes with some perhaps not entirely negative consequences, at least in some cases, but perhaps the US, of course, has its own record now to defend in addition to that of the British Empire. It's an interesting way of looking at it. I think it's clear by the end of the war that Britain has been kind of kicked to the curb to some extent, even though she hasn't withdrawn from India yet. It's kind of pretty clear that's the way things are trending.
Dr. Meekin, having difficulty hearing you, please could you speak into the microphone?
Oh, I'm sorry. Were you not able to hear?
I did hear some of it, but not all of it. Yeah, that would be helpful.
My
Thank
apologies.
you.
Can you hear better now? Do you want?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to repeat
Yeah,
exactly what I
this
said, but
works.
just a little more about how interesting this relationship between Roosevelt and Churchill is, and the ways in which the U.S. Perhaps is trying to pressure Churchill into treating India perhaps more generously, and maybe not with complete success, but at least getting Churchill to make a few concessions, however genuine. And the U.S., I guess this is one area where the U.S. does not. I talk about the U.S. to some extent absorbing a lot of Britain's imperial responsibilities. India maybe is a counter example to that rule, where the U.S. doesn't really take the same kind of dominant role it does with a lot of Britain's other imperial outposts, the coaling stations, the bases, the Western Hemisphere, the security commitments to Greece and Turkey, et cetera. In the case of India, I guess you really do have a period of genuine independence after the war. I mean, perhaps I'm wrong. I mean, was the U.S. actually particularly influential in India? My impression is, particularly during the Cold War, not so much so, perhaps even a bit more today than earlier, but it's not something I've ever really studied.
I do agree that the War Cabinet was really terrified that the US would increase its influence in India. And that, in fact, during the famine, the US had offered wheat and rice as famine relief, and the War Cabinet turned it down. But of course, Churchill also turned down offers of wheat from Canada.
But why did he do that, Professor? Why did he turn it down?
I think he wanted to use all of the available shipping and all of the wheat under the control of the British Empire as part of this global stockpile. And there's plenty of evidence of that.
Well, I have it here, ma'am. And, we just about everything Winston Churchill wrote and said has been published in document volumes. And I've been searching them here, and many of the things you say, I don't find, but here. And so, first of all, the specific reason the Canadian wheat was turned down is Churchill said, we are getting ready to move the largest forces in the world ever all over Europe. We means all the allies for an invasion. And meanwhile, all over Europe, Jews are being exterminated. The most humane thing to do was to get the war over with. And that's what they were talking about. And here's Churchill's directive in October 1943 to the newly appointed Viceroy designate of India. The material and cultural conditions of the many people of India will naturally engage your earnest attention. The hard pressures of world war have for the first time for many years brought conditions of scarcity, verging in some localities into actual famine upon India. Every effort must be made, even by the diversion of shipping urgently needed for war purposes, to deal with the local shortages. And it goes on like that. And there are 6 or 7, I have them all here, I can count them, cabinet resolutions about this during the famine. And every time there's a resolve by everybody, led by Churchill, to get grain to India if we can find a way. In other words, there's at least another side of this, but there are several historians who've called seriously into question what you've written in your book. And you need
I challenge you to find a single error in my book. Everything that I say is thoroughly referenced.
Did you
and
read
yes, Churchill I read pretty much all of his papers. And yes, Churchill did have he was great at rhetoric. In fact, Wavell and Amory, after that speech, they both said it was a lot of hot air. Amory said Wavell is being wafted to India on a balloon of hot air. That speech was for public consumption. And
I'm reading, ma'am. I'm reading from a cabinet minute, right? These are not even public documents. And they make resolutions after everybody's expressing concern to take every step they can, and they take many steps to try to relieve. And I can't find anywhere where Winston Churchill said or implied that he wanted the Indian people to starve.
I would suggest that you read my book, Dr. Meakin, because all of the references are in there. And I was well aware that everything I said would be attacked. So
I'm not attacking you. I'm calling into question because you
I'm
said
saying,
some
yes,
hard
you are.
things.
If you are calling into question what I say, you are attacking
that's-
me. And
that's what we
everything
did.
that I have said is referenced thoroughly in my book. And
Yes.
yes, Churchill said a lot of very fine things. He was an excellent orator, as you well know.
Yes,
And he
ma'am.
was also very good at self-deception. He indeed may have believed himself to be India's liberator. But the fact is, when it actually came to scheduling famine relief, the war cabinet said no. And it said no, despite the fact that wheat was available, ships were available. Those ships were instead sent to Australia to pick up wheat for storage. And all of this is all something that I document in my book.
I assert, ma'am, that that's false. That the cabinet never said no when there were ships available. This went on for about a year, and there are many discussions of it. And they're all published. Anybody can look it up. And I don't see where they ever did that. And I see the contrary in many places in official records of the cabinet. So
in that case, we'll just have to beg to differ. And I suggest that anyone who's interested read my book, and they will find every reference, and they can look up every reference.
Could I ask about the sources? I'm curious about this. I hope you can hear me now because I'm speaking to the mic. We're talking about cabinet minutes on the one hand, and some of these remarks which you had in the PowerPoint on the other, which sounded a little more off the cuff. Things like rabbits, these kind of discussion of pollution, this sort of thing. I'm just curious. One could certainly imagine Churchill saying things off the cuff, perhaps with aides or in private communications, that may or may not somehow be indirectly reflected in decisions made by the cabinet. Those quotes, I'm guessing, I haven't read your bibliography, I'm guessing these are they from private papers? Are they from private letters? Are they from remarks or memoirs or diaries? I'm curious where those particular, the more kind of explosive, almost incendiary rhetoric was from.
Well, some of it, the original, of course, some of it, 1897, that's from his autobiography, My Early Life. And there's one of those quotes, I think that was from one of his letters. Later quotes during war cabinet meetings, a lot of that's from Amory's diary. Wavell also wrote diaries in which he described war cabinet meetings. And but what I try to show in my book is that not only did Churchill have these views, but they had a real impact on Indians. And for those sources come from the Ministry of Shipping documents, Ministry of War Transport documents at the National Archives in Kew. And those were sources that no one had ever actually looked at until I did. A lot of those, there's also the War Office documents, talks about scorched earth policies. So I used a multitude of sources. And I would say the quotes are, they're there. They're because Churchill was actually not very rational during the latter half of the war. You see that in Field Marshal Alan Brooks' discussions. He says, he's just constantly focusing on one thing or the other. Amory actually accused him in one of these war cabinet meetings when he was like going on and on about how terrible Indians were, of having views that he couldn't see the difference between Churchill's views and Hitler's. Now, that's interesting because Amory had Jewish heritage, and he was very well aware of the horrible things that the Nazis were doing. But
so a lot of this is coming from Amory's.
A lot of it's coming from a lot of the quotes
from...
are coming from Amory's diaries. Yeah.
No, I'm curious only because I wasn't there, and I suppose none of us were there at these meetings, and I can imagine sometimes things might be said off the cuff, and maybe they do reflect someone's real views. They don't necessarily get reflected in the actual policies. I guess that's what Dr. Arndt was trying to get at. Is he actually on the record saying, for example, that you had to stop the
No,
ship?
and that's actually interesting because there are war cabinet meetings all the way And then they just, transcripts of war cabinet meetings that you can read. And then they just suddenly stop at a time when these meetings happen. And there are no transcripts as such of these war cabinet meetings. There are some scribbled notes.
I've been working in those sources for 45 years now. And the great majority of everything concerning Churchill is published in a book that you can find in the library. You can go look it up. And
what I want to say is that when I looked at the UK archives, I had the impression that they had definitely been scrubbed to an extent. But I was lucky in finding the archives that I did in the Ministry of War Transport, which showed the actual decisions made during these meetings. And I was able to fill in some of the background with Amory's diaries. But curious enough, there are no war cabinet transcripts for these particular meetings.
So let me add something that might help here. I think that Churchill was wrong in some important respects about India. I think that he thought that India would fall apart when the British left. There were 1 million people, at least, who were killed in the civil war that happened after that. But he was wrong. He thought that there was not such a thing as India yet, and that was still to be built. And so I think he was in error about that. But a war criminal and deliberately starving millions of people, that's a serious charge, ma'am, and you can't prove it. Or you can't prove it.
I suggest you try reading my book, Dr. Arnn.
I've been working on it, but I can't, it's a little, I will tell you, every document that I've read from is published in a book that's part of the largest biography ever written. And it took from 1962 until 2019 to put all that together. And it's 34 volumes counting the documents. And there are 4,000 footnotes in the average document volume. So in other words, you can read the actual text. Here's one. This is Leo Amory talking in the House of Commons, answering a question in the House of Commons on 12 October 1943. That means it's in this period. This is Amory. At the beginning of the year, His Majesty's government provided the necessary shipping for substantial imports of grain to India in order to meet prospects of a serious shortage, which were subsequently relieved by an excellent spring harvest in northern India. Since the recrudescence of the shortage in an acute form, we have made every effort to provide shipping, and considerable quantities of food grains are now arriving or are due to arrive before the end of the year. So that's Amory's account of this.
Amory is providing a public statement. He's trying to explain to the British Parliament and the British people why the famine happened. You have to look at his diaries to see the real.
I have looked at them, and I know about his diaries. As a matter of fact, there are about 5 direct accusations that Winston Churchill was a racist, and 3 of them are in Leo Amory's diaries. And there are reasons to believe they're unreliable, but let's say they're not, right? But if you want to accuse somebody of a terrible wrong, you might cite the evidence which is published that undercuts that thesis, and it would be more believable.
Well, I suggest that you try
these things. You have
not.
not.
All I can say.
If
you find a single author, I would be happy to know.
Sorry, excuse me. I wonder, we have a question that's coming on the Q&A that might focus on a particular specific issue about this. And questioner asked, what about Churchill's negative comments about Gandhi, and do they reflect an attitude towards colonialism or race that factors into the background of this discussion and the different perspectives that we're hearing about? I wonder, just to kind of take it into that specific figure of Gandhi and Churchill's comments or interactions with Gandhi, if perhaps our speakers might have any thoughts on that one aspect, which may or may not be related to these other issues.
I have a few, yeah. Churchill called Gandhi a half-naked fakir striding up the steps of Government House. And he didn't like Gandhi. He did, by the way, adore and celebrate as a great hero later, Nehru. And when the Indian settlement was made in whenever the Government of India Act passed, this is published. There's a man named G.D. Birla, and he was Gandhi's representative in London. And he writes a letter about a conversation he had with Gandhi. He said, no friend of our cause, that means the Congress Party, a great friend of India is Winston Churchill. And we had a lovely lunch, and he invited me to his home, and we spent the entire weekend talking. Now that's an example. I mean, that's Gandhi's man, right? And he didn't write that letter to anybody in England. He wrote it back to Gandhi. Martin Gilbert, the Churchill biographer, he went and found it. And my point then is, if you give a whole account of this thing, you will see, I mean, there's a heck of a lot of tragedy in the world, right, at this time. And the whole world has gone to pot, and Britain is in a weak position, right? I mean, it's one of the three predators. Well, I don't think so, but never mind. If it is one of the three, it's the weakest of the three. And that would be something to be admitted, ma'am.
Churchill was a complex man. By the way, he also described Gandhi as a malignant, subversive fanatic. Gandhi was really baffling to Churchill because Churchill was a military man. He believed in triumph through martial arms, warfare. And Churchill was, Gandhi, of course, was a man of nonviolence, but he was powerful. And to such an extent, he was leading the Indian national movement and threatening the foundations of the British Empire. And that was the source of Churchill's hostility towards
What
Gandhi.
Churchill did with the great majority of his life was he was a statesman, a politician, like Gandhi. And to say that everything was conquest, I said it and I can prove it. It's been proved by 100 people. Winston Churchill was always reluctant about war because he saw the horrors of it. And he didn't like this war, and he watched his country. And see, I think in that very dramatic thing I described, which is maybe the most dramatic, and my colleague over there described it too, one of the most dramatic interventions in history, in British history, in any history, is Churchill persuaded the cabinet to stay in the war rather than make an agreement with Hitler. And he's the one who had predicted that will be the decline of our country. And he hated that, right? But here's what he said. You can find, for example, lots of French and Dutch and other officials who are living under the Nazis, and they're helping deport Jews to Auschwitz. And they don't want to, most of them probably, but they'll shoot their families if they don't. And what Churchill said in that great speech on the 28th of 1940, he said, better to die than get in bed with that. And that's because Hitler was a racist, and Churchill hated that. And that's just true, right? And he wrote these beautiful things, but he also did these beautiful things and was responsible for them. And you know why he did the Dardanelles? He thought that the trench warfare would be the death of Britain itself and every good thing. And you got to find a cheaper way. You got to find a way around. And that means Churchill spent his life trying to mitigate war. And this thing, I mean, as I say, I adore India. I think I hope it's the most important country in the world. But this is not helpful, right? I mean, to the extent it's true, it's helpful, but I'm claiming that it's not.
Could I add just one small thing here? Perhaps this is coming from a slightly different angle, but not being an expert on Churchill or Gandhi, I have taught Gandhi recently to young first-year students at a fairly progressive liberal arts college. And I think it's an interesting sign of just how difficult it is to, I think, appreciate historical figures and all their complexity, that of course even Gandhi is now under threat of cancellation because of his role in South Africa and some of the views that he expressed over the years regarding Africans, regarding Blacks, some of his own racial views. And I say this not to disparage Gandhi, but to say that I do think it's often important to have a holistic view of characters like this. I mean, frankly, none of us, if every single one of our thoughts and utterances were ever exposed to the full scrutiny, the blast of scrutiny that I think a major historical figure like Churchill has, would avoid some level of scrutiny. I do think you have to look at a career as a whole, at character as a whole, and so that I wouldn't want to judge Gandhi based on several indiscreet remarks he might have made, nor would I want to judge, I don't think, Churchill on those grounds. I think actions, certainly, that is political actions, actions that have consequences, policies, decisions made. Even there, though, you look at the fog of war, you look at all the various decisions that a leader in the Second World War has to make, all the different dilemmas, all the different trade-offs, priorities, resources, different campaigns, inter-allied diplomacy, coalition warfare, the immense amount of problems that are going to come onto the plate of someone who's both prime minister and effectively in charge of the war ministry as well. I think it's important that we don't necessarily judge people through the lens of our current views and prejudices, but we do try to understand them on their own terms. I think in all their flaws and all their complexities, it's not really maybe quite as simple as kind of hero or colonialist.
I think one of the questions here perhaps is, it's been raised by, in the discussion, that Churchill may have drained the British Empire to defeat Nazism, but then how much was that draining at the cost of Indians in the colonial situation, and trying to figure that out. I would, and you know, finding this really interesting to hear this whole discussion. We do have microphones set up here in the front, and I would just like to remind everyone to please feel free to come down if you have a question. I think there was a hand up in the back there, is that right? That please come down and feel free to ask a question. We did have, I guess we have a couple more questions here. I don't want to cut short the discussion. Maybe we said that this would go to 9 o'clock as a hard ending. And so speakers, please feel free to, you know, kind of continue commenting or get back to things. But in one question that came up from the folks online, and then we have a question here, it was a question about Churchill's comments to Mountbatten, Lord Mountbatten, who was the last viceroy of India, I believe, last British viceroy of India. Churchill's comments to Mountbatten on the cusp of Indian independence. I'm not even sure what those comments were, but I believe that was the question, Josh.
Yes, sir. I'm Margaret Shelley from Sunbury. I used to be a federal government nurse. Actually, I worked as the nurse on duty during the Gandhi visit to the National Gallery of Art. I was an occupational health nurse, head nurse there. But anyway, in my course of living in Northern Virginia, I met in my condo building 2 English citizens, one who's still living at 85 and one who's probably about 80 and not sure if she's still living. They were in England during the war when Churchill was probably prime minister, and one was in Exeter, London area, about 4 hours from London, and the other one was rural England, and they were World War II. And before the Americans came and rescued them, they were short of food there. Both of them were starving, some of them. I just wondered what he did about his own people during that time when it was World War II and before the Americans came and rescued them.
I'll comment on that. Britain had food rationing 2 years longer than Germany after the war. Britain was broke. I happen to be married to an English lady, the greatest lady in the world, I dare say. And her father was a camp commander of a Japanese POW camp. And her uncle, one of her two uncles, was sent north to work on the Burma Railway to invade India, which is one of the things that cut off the food supply. Her other uncle was part of British forces and Indian forces that were going to meet those soldiers. And the point is, Britain had a very hard war there. You know, the war was terrible everywhere it touched. It was a misery, and it compromised valuable things everywhere in the war. And the idea that, and see, Winston Churchill was never a dictator, right? You say he's the most powerful prime minister in the world. He could be dismissed any day, and he was facing necessities. He thought the German, you know, he prepared a speech to the British people. He writes that he prepared it. We don't have the speech. In the event that the Germans landed, which he thought they might in the summer of 1940 or 41, he prepared a speech because he was advised that it wasn't possible to defend the coast because the troops would have to be too spread out. And so London was going to fall for sure. And so he wrote a speech and he called it, "You Can Take One With You." That meant he was willing to ask things like that of his own people. And the war was terrible on Britain. So, and you know, if you don't regret the Second World War and everything about it, you've got no mind and you've got no heart. And the bad things that happen in India, they're part of the toll and they're deeply to be regretted. But why should they be a division among the forces that took down Adolf Hitler? And as in that really great book, recently published, Stalin's War, that war was insufficient. It did not take down Joe Stalin, and he was at least as bad. And so it's a tragic world in this time. And if you're looking for who the bad ones are, one of my favorite stories, there's an American boxer named Joe Louis, and he was a black man. And in those days, Americans treated black people very badly. And he went and served in the Second World War. And he was asked, how can you go and serve in the army for a country that treats you like this? And he said, there's nothing wrong with America that Hitler can fix. So you're looking for evil? The Japanese Empire? You know what the policy of the Japanese Empire was? A New York Times reporter asked the Governor General of Formosa, what is your policy toward the people of Taiwan? And he said, quoting the Bible, I will whip them with scorpions, right? That, and you know, you look at evil empires, look at those. Look at the Soviet Union. Look what it did. And look what China is doing right now. And so the British Empire may have been bad, and it certainly committed many wrongs, but it wasn't like those.
Well, I think the point about the suffering in the war is very, very well taken. Stalin, in many ways, was comparable to Hitler in many of his crimes. On the other hand, you also have to reckon the suffering of the Soviet people. I mean, most current estimates say that they lost 27 million men in the war, and we're not even really sure if that number is exhaustive or definitive, if you include also civilians and those, of course, killed by the Soviet authorities or who starved to death or died of disease or malnutrition. There was one Russian historian who came up with a figure in the mid-90s of 46 million dead, just to put things in perspective. Which is not by any means to belittle or say the suffering of the people of Bengal was not terrible, but to say that it was a pretty bad war all around.
The worst ever in all history.
We have another question from the floor here.
This is for Dr. McMeekin. You mentioned earlier that Churchill wanted Germany to invade the Soviet Union in some ways.
I'll get to it. Yeah.
I was wondering if you believe that he could have wanted this, even though it would lead to the demise of the empire's power globally. because of what he saw in World War I. And he believed that the only way to defeat Germany and Hitler was to create a two-front war.
Well, so the period I'm talking about basically is in between the fall of France in June 1940 and then the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. This is the period of England alone, it's often called, where you hear talk about the finest hour. It's kind of central to the Churchill legend, but also to Churchill, it was quite painful, of course, because aside from perhaps Greece, after Greece resisted the Italian invasion, there weren't really allies of any kind. The Dominions, certainly, Britain is perhaps relying on our dominions. So it was more a matter of partly wishful thinking. At one point, he almost muses that he hopes that the Russians will attack, and that's because when Germany was occupying France in the Low Countries, temporarily her eastern defenses were actually much weaker. This is in July 1940. Later on, there are the famous warnings where Churchill shares various intercepts. The British had very good intelligence at Bletchley Park about German troop movements trying to both warn Stalin, but from Stalin's perspective, he actually thinks Churchill's almost trying to goad him into war with Hitler. The really famous episode is that of the Rudolf Hess affair. And so this is in May. It was actually on my birthday, May 10th, 1941. I wasn't born yet then. I'm not quite that. But it was on that date when Rudolf Hess kind of crash lands down in Scotland. And ever since, the official story has been that he had either kind of lost his mind or been a bit of a renegade. He was, however, effectively Hitler's second in command. And the way Stalin looked at this was effectively that Hitler was trying to cut a deal with Churchill, and he was afraid that the deal would be that Churchill would make peace with Hitler and Hitler would invade the Soviet Union. Now, we know Churchill never really considered that as a possibility. I mean, that's definitely something he never would have countenanced, but he did, to some extent, hope that the Soviet Union would be drawn in the war in the same way he hoped the United States would. And I mean, that's a whole nother story. The British role in egging on, to some extent, manipulating the United States into belligerence in the war, at least trying to very hard through back channels, advising the formation of what would soon be the OSS-CIA. That was another angle. But effectively, you could say it's either a self-fulfilling prophecy or effective diplomacy. Churchill's aim was to create basically a grand alliance, the US and the USSR joining him against Hitler, and in the end, it came to pass, more or less, as he either hoped or planned or predicted or to some extent helped bring it into being.
Thank you.
So
I'll add something to that. That's a very good point. And go back 10 years earlier than the beginning of the war. Hitler comes to power in January, not 10 years, but 7 years, in January 1933. Churchill had been calling for 6 months for Britain and the United States and France to rearm themselves because this guy is bad. And he thought that the fact that that was not done, he terms that whole period the years that the locust hath eaten. And so by the time you get to the eve of the Second World War, the situation is desperate. And then they took France out in 6 weeks, and nobody thought they could do that. And so Churchill started talking about an alliance with the Soviet Union in 1938. And Mr. McMeekin rightly points out he would have been a very reluctant guy to do that. And that was certainly not his first recommendation. But there you are, right? And then we in the United States and Britain helped to arm the Soviet Union, and they were rolling. And and see, you give those weapons to the Soviet Union instead of keeping yourselves, well, then you're sparing your own citizens. And I said in my summary remarks, because I didn't come here to try to prove anything today, because it's hard to do that in a panel like this. But what I can prove, I assert, is that Churchill was always looking for a way to mitigate the cost of war. And the chances to do that were gone by 1938, 1939. And so and it was his fate to pick up the pieces. And he did pick them up, and he did it very well. But Lord, it was hell for everybody in the world, and including hell for the British.
let me just ask to follow up on the question that we had from the Q&A tab. And that was about, I should take this off so I could be heard better. That was about Churchill's comments to Mountbatten, Lord Mountbatten, on the cusp of India's independence. And I'm not sure what those comments were. That was what the questioner was asking online from our virtual audience, but I thought I would pass that along. And we have one more, we have a student here at the microphone. So if anyone has, any of the speakers, if any of you all have comments on that virtual question, Churchill's, what about Churchill's comments to Mountbatten on the cusp of India's independence, if that makes sense to you all? And then we'll go with the students' question, and then we'll kind of wrap up, and maybe if the speakers are generous enough with your time, you could just give us a sort of a brief final comments, but maybe we'll start with that online question, and I don't know if any of you have any thoughts on that.
I have a vague recollection that Churchill's comments to Mountbatten at this time, when India is becoming independent, were very positive about India. And I agree that he was a complex man. And when he saw people as an enemy, his enmity was absolute. And during the war, he saw Indians as enemies because they wanted independence. But he was very changeable. I forget who it was, if it was Alan Brooke. He said that Churchill at the crest of the wave, and I'm sure Dr. Arnn knows this quote, can be a tyrant. But it seems to me from looking at his quotes that after the wave has crashed, there was introspection and humility. And I don't actually remember exactly what he said to Mountbatten, but I do remember there was an event in London that was attended by the daughter of Nehru, Indira Gandhi, who would later become the Prime Minister of India. And they were standing together next to each other, waiting for their cars to drive up. And Churchill said to Indira Gandhi, "You must have hated us." And she said, "We never hated you." And he said, "I hated you, but I don't anymore."
Yeah, I do not believe that there was a day when Churchill woke up in the morning thinking of the Indian people as enemies. He didn't like that uprising in 1943 that contributed to the famine. He didn't like it that Gandhi wrote a letter to Adolf Hitler addressed "Dear Friend," right? He thought that was bad. And he didn't like Gandhi, that's a fact. But there were many of the Indian statesmen that he admired deeply. And he got on with them. And here's where I think he was wrong myself. And that's best judgment I can make. He underestimated the fact that India had become a thing. It had become a nation, and it hung together. It did partition and split, and there was a lot of deaths after the British left, as Churchill predicted, but it didn't shatter into a million pieces. It shattered into three. And then, we can speculate. I mean, we can form an opinion about a quote that we do not know. That'll be fun. But Churchill held Mountbatten accountable for the pace at which the flag came down. And he thought that was premature. That's a fact. But, but by this time, even before the war, Churchill was resigned about this. And if it's true, as I think it's true, that the most murderous regimes in history are Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, and you have to include China. Well, those have been leading the world on a dance for a long time now. And the Indian Army fought against them. And, they should, I pay them profound respect for that. And Churchill did too. And he thought, see, here's a strange thing about Churchill. He was the most prolific of the statesmen, and he was the most experienced. And so he sort of carried around in his mind what it would take to fight a world war. And that's one of the reasons that he didn't want to fight it. But sure enough, when Hitler arrives, he's casting around, where do we get the force to beat this guy back? And India was one of the places, as it had been in the First World War. And he thought that was important. And he longed for the day when India would have the same relations with Britain that Australia had in those days, or South Africa, or Canada. And he thought that day would come and predicted it many times. But he didn't get his way. It really hurt his feelings when India resigned from the Commonwealth. He wanted them at least stay in that, right? And he courted them to do that. And he's an old man by then. So this animosity to India, some of the things Churchill said when he's 21 years old, first, what are we all like when we're 21 years old? And Churchill was a soldier when he was 21 years old. And he was pretty, he was salty, right? And so soldiers talk about how we can beat anybody. We're going to pummel them into the ground. There are things like that, he said. But Churchill grew a lot, and he had an enormous capacity to grow. And he was generous in victory and in defeat. And his comments about India and Nehru, he had a genuine admiration for Nehru. He called him one of the greatest statesmen of the age. He didn't like Gandhi. That's true.
I don't mean to cut things short, but we are running short on time. If I could just ask the speakers to respond to one more question, this last question from the audience, from a student here. Please go ahead.
Testing. All right. Hello, my name is Maximus Bean from Belmar, and the whole what people know most about Winston Churchill's legacy is essentially World War II. But after World War II, Churchill basically got the boot from the British people. And the question that I want to ask is essentially, what led to that? What led to his post-World War expulsion from power, essentially?
So what led to the election in 1945, where he and his party were voted out of power in Britain, which it seems from a little I've read that was a shock, especially to Americans who just sort of assumed, Churchill was the powerful Allied leader in Britain. So, what do our speakers?
Well, I could do a short version of the answer. I mean, although the war with Japan was still ongoing when he was voted out of office in July 1945, to some extent, I think the view of a lot of the British public was the war was over and Churchill had done his job. Which is not to say that's necessarily the reason all of them gave him the boot. He was also, the campaign got a little nasty and Labor had supported the war. And to some extent, I think people probably saw some of his rhetoric as perhaps being ungenerous. But I think there was just this idea that he was a wartime prime minister and the war was over, time for a change. Again, that's perhaps a simplistic reading of circumstance, but oftentimes that does seem to be the man had his moment and the moment to some extent had passed. Of course, he gets elected back to office later on, so his career is not over. But I think to some extent there was a little bit of this sentiment of now the war's over, let's move on.
And there were, so, Churchill gave many public accounts of it, and one private account, which is a letter he wrote to a man named Alfred W. Cooper. That letter too is published. In the public accounts, he said, they have had a very hard time. And we, the Conservative Party, are largely responsible for that. And that, and he was very sympathetic to them. And, my mother and father-in-law are dead now, but they told me about those years, right? And my father-in-law was back from POW camp, and you couldn't get very much to eat. In the private letter, he says, it's a speculation, a fear. And it's a close friend he writes it to. Maybe the British people have been broken by this, which I feared. And that's, it was a hard thing, right? And he he was very tough. That is to say, he could keep going. You read the story of his life in the 1930s. He almost, in 1938, he almost got out of politics because he was broke, because he lost a lot of money in the American stock market, and because the Conservative Party, with whom he was at odds over appeasement, were doing everything they could to cut off his livelihood, which is through publishing. And he almost quit. And then here's a great thing that happened. There's a man named Henry Strakosch, a Jew from Germany, who was an industrialist, and he started bringing Churchill information about industrial activity in Germany, which of course predicted war. And he found out that Churchill was about to quit, and he bought Churchill's entire stock portfolio. Churchill bought many of his stocks in October 1929, when he arrived in New York to go on a lecture tour, and he'd been paid in advance for it. And so Churchill was underwater, and he bought those stocks. And then in 1952, he sold them back to Churchill. They were above water by then, for what he had paid Churchill for them. So this guy who hated Hitler because Hitler was just, he was going to exterminate the Jews, and he built factories for that purpose. So the point is, you know, Churchill in much of his life is hanging on by his fingernails, and he was tough. He kept going.
So if there aren't further thoughts on that question, maybe just briefly, you know, we're over time here, so thank you to all of our speakers for the generosity of your time. But briefly, maybe I could just ask each of you to just sum up a final thought on either the conversation tonight, the title of the program, or just a final view that you would like to leave people with on some of the questions and perspectives that we've heard about tonight, different views of Churchill. What in the end can we make of him, either as a historical figure or as some kind of legendary figure being re-examined today? So maybe we could go in reverse order or not, I don't know, but Dr. Mukherjee, you're the farthest away of our speakers here, so maybe, and it's the earliest time, if you can hear me here, I forgot to take my mask off. But if you would like to offer any final wisdom for us.
I should say that I originally started researching the book that I wrote because I wanted to understand the origins of poverty. And the things that I wasn't interested in Churchill, I came across the things that I wrote about. And my actual indictment is not so much of Churchill himself as of imperialism, and not just British imperialism. I see imperialism which in its entirety included slavery, for example, subjugation of Africa, South America, Asia, and a constant exploitation of tens of millions of people. And it completely changed the global economy. I know that it's pleasing to think of the West as having become wealthy by means of its own ingenuity and inventiveness and brilliance. But the more you study imperialism, you realize that the setup that we have in the world now, we still have in the world now, has a lot to do with that imperial heritage. And I should say that through that book, I finally understood why India was as poor as it was. And I still think it's poor. We have incredible inequality now, and India is not what I would like it to be. But that's my essential indictment of imperialism. And I think it's very hard to see the essential evil, if I may say, because we are among the winners. I see myself as a winner. My people were collaborators. I speak English fluently, partly because I come from a class of people that helped the British administer India. And I think it's very hard to see what imperialism was when you are among the winners. And that's really my goal. And I think Churchill is a symbol of that imperialism. Individually, he's just a human being, and I have no hostility towards him.
We'll kind of work our way, thank you, Dr. McCarthy. We'll kind of work our way sort of
All right.
back, yeah, so
Okay,
Professor McMeekin.
I guess I'm next. Well, I left dangling the Mediterranean stratagem earlier, and I'll return to it very briefly. I'll try not to go on for too long because I know we're already running a bit late. What interests me about this is the Tehran conference. I call it in the book, I call it Churchill's last stand. That is the last stand for the British Empire. What I find so beguiling and fascinating about it is, again, this sense of almost ineffability. As I think Dr. Arndt put it, Churchill saw that the war might lead to the demise of the British Empire, but then in the end, he decides to fight the war nonetheless. There's still one moment at Tehran where he thinks he sees a chance that Britain might emerge from the war still with some influence and some power, at least in the Eastern Mediterranean, perhaps the Middle East. He wants to get Roosevelt to see it. Basically, British and the Americans, they've got 500,000 troops in Italy, 68 landing craft, they have air bases. Why not use them for something? You could land them in the Adriatic, bring Turkey into the war, make a decisive move on the chessboard, maybe even link up with the Soviet armies, move on through the Balkans, end the war early. And the theme goes back to Gallipoli in the First World War, his idea that maybe they could have ended the war early before another 2 years go on, millions more people die of all kinds of reasons, and maybe something good can emerge from the ruins. It's a last stand, it's a bit lonely. As I pointed out, Roosevelt doesn't back him up. Roosevelt sides with Stalin. They decide to put everything into Overlord instead. They move all the landing craft away from Italy. They basically rule out any operations, the Adriatic and Mediterranean. There is an element of, again, I don't know if it's tragedy exactly, but I think Churchill sees it happening as he's happening. His whole life has been about the preservation of the devotion to the British Empire, in which he wholeheartedly believes, but he sees it slipping away. I think it's poignant. I think it tells us not only about the possibilities of a career, the possibilities of either politics, leadership, statesmanship, but also in the end, the limitations that in the end, even the most visionary, imaginative of statesmen are probably in the end doomed not to be able to fulfill their ambitions and dreams. And perhaps that's just the nature of human affairs.
Well, thank you, Professor McMeekin. And Dr. Arndt, do you have some final words of wisdom for us?
Well, the title of Churchill's 6-volume Second World War is, the last volume is Triumph and Tragedy is the last word. And I think he expected that. I think, just remember in Churchill's view of the world, in my opinion, was realistic. He thought that people get rich by giving everybody a chance and living in harmony with each other. His claim is that that was the way India was going, and Britain was helping with them. That's controversial, but it's consistent with everything else he supported in his life. And why did he hate the Germans? I mean, he didn't. He loved the Germans. He hated the Nazis. And why? Because it's not your quality, it's your race, it's your something. And he hated that kind of thing all his life. And I won't make any new arguments now, but well, I'll make one and I'll shut up. When Churchill uses the term race, he generally means peoples. And that's the way they used it for most of his life, right? So the British race, the American race, you know, I don't know what you make of America, but you can't make it out to be a race. It's a people. And he thought that peoples might have something special to contribute. For example, resisting Hitler. When Churchill gave his finest hour speech, he says, if the British Empire should last 1,000 years, men will still say this was their finest hour. They were going to sacrifice everything, but think what a gloomy thing that is to say. This is the peak, and it's all downhill from here. the British sacrificed themselves, and they've never been as important or relatively speaking to other nations as rich as they were any time before that. Tragedy.
Well, thank you, Dr. Arnn, too, and thank you to all our speakers tonight. You've really challenged and provoked them in a productive way. My thinking on this made me want to read more about all these topics that were raised, and we really appreciate all of you being here. Dr. McMeekin in the wintry weather here. We hope you travel back safely. And also, Dr. Mukherjee, thank you again for being with us and so early.
Do I have a question? Is it warm over there in India right now?
It's winter, but yeah, it's actually very pleasant. You should visit.
That's not fair.
Well, maybe we'll have a reunion of the discussion here.
That's good. Next time in India.
Does sound awfully appealing.
And also thank you, Dr. Arnn, as well. So real good. Well, good night from Bucknell, and thanks to everybody who came in person and also online. And again, especially to our speakers, our esteemed speakers. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much.